In parts of Mexico, once a year, families carry flowers, candles, and food to the graves of their loved ones. They sit beside them. They eat. They drink. They laugh. Children run between the headstones. In Tibet, monks spend years meditating on the precise details of their own death, visualizing it, rehearsing it, until the fear of it quietly dissolves. In ancient Rome, Stoic philosophers kept a skull on their desk, not as a morbid joke, but as a daily reminder. This is coming. Make something of the time you have. These aren't fringe practices. These are entire cultures that developed, over centuries, a fundamentally different relationship with death than most of the modern Western world has. The question is, how? And what exactly do they know that we've largely forgotten or never learned? Before asking why some cultures don't fear death, it's worth understanding why so many do, and why the fear runs so deep. The most influential psychological framework for understanding death anxiety comes from a theory developed in the 1980s, building on the work of cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker. It's called terror management theory. The core idea is this: human beings are unique among animals in their ability to know, with certainty, that they will die. Every other animal acts on survival instinct without truly comprehending mortality. We do both. And that knowledge, that your existence will end completely and irreversibly, generates a fundamental existential terror that sits below the surface of daily life. Hundreds of psychological studies have since built on this framework. They've shown that when people are reminded of their own mortality, even subtly, even briefly, their behavior shifts in predictable and often surprising ways. They become more defensive of their own beliefs. They are more hostile to people who see the world differently. They cling more tightly to cultural symbols and group identities. They work harder, spend more, and try to leave larger marks on the world. All of these, according to terror management theory, are unconscious strategies for managing an anxiety that most people never directly confront. You don't sit down and think, "I'm afraid of death," but you buy the house, pursue the career, have the children, chase the legacy, and underneath all of it, the theory argues, is the same quiet drive to matter, to persist, to leave something behind. The cultures that appear to fear death less aren't cultures without this awareness. They're cultures that found a different way to handle it. The Mexican tradition of Dia de Muertos, the Day of the Dead, is one of the most visually striking examples of a culture that refuses to keep death at a distance. The holiday, observed on November 1st and 2nd, has roots stretching back thousands of years to Aztec and other Mesoamerican traditions of ancestor worship, later blended with Catholic observances brought during colonization. The result is something entirely its own, a celebration of the dead that is genuinely, unapologetically joyful. Central to the tradition is the belief that on these days, the boundary between the living and the dead becomes permeable. The spirits of those who have died return to visit their families, so families build ofrendas, elaborate altars in homes and public spaces, decorated with marigolds, candles, photographs, and the deceased's favorite foods. They're not mourning, they're hosting. The key psychological mechanism here isn't denial. It isn't pretending death doesn't happen. It's the opposite. It's integration. Death is brought fully into the community, given color and food and laughter. The relationship with the dead doesn't end at the grave. It changes form. Research comparing grief outcomes across cultures has found that practices involving continued bonds with the deceased, grave visits, household shrines, regular remembrance, are consistently associated with better psychological well-being and lower death anxiety than practices that emphasize severance and closure. The Western instinct to move on may, paradoxically, make death harder to live with. Tibetan Buddhism takes an almost opposite approach, not celebration and integration, but direct, systematic confrontation. The Bardo Thodol, widely known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, is one of the most detailed manuals for dying ever written. Composed in the 8th century, it was designed to be read aloud to the dying and the recently dead, guiding consciousness through the intermediate state between this life and the next. But its deeper function is for the living, to familiarize practitioners with death before it arrives, through years of dedicated meditation practice. Tibetan Buddhist monks spend significant portions of their training on what are called Maranasati practices, meditations on mortality. They visualize the death of the body in specific detail, the cooling of limbs, the dissolution of the senses, the stages of departure, not to cultivate despair, but to cultivate familiarity. The logic is precise. Fear, in this framework, is largely a product of the unknown and the unexamined. The less familiar death feels, the more power it has. Repeated, structured contemplation of death doesn't magnify the fear. Over time, it steadily diminishes it. Studies examining the death anxiety of long-term meditators, including research published in journals examining mindfulness and terror management, have found measurably lower death anxiety in practitioners with consistent contemplative practice, consistent with what Tibetan tradition has argued, through practical experience, for over 1,000 years. The ancient Stoic philosophers of Greece and Rome arrived at a remarkably similar conclusion through entirely different means, not through spiritual tradition, but through pure reasoning. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled Rome as emperor while also writing what would become one of the most widely read philosophical texts in history, returned repeatedly in his private notes to the fact of death, not with anxiety, but with a particular deliberate clarity. He wrote that to think well, you must keep death visible, not to be morbid, but because the awareness of it clarifies what actually matters. The Stoic practice most directly tied to this is memento mori. Remember that you will die. It wasn't a threat. It was a tool. Stoics kept physical reminders of mortality nearby. They regularly asked themselves, if this were my last day, is what I'm doing worth doing? Would I still be consumed by this anxiety, this petty argument, this obsession with what others think of me? The philosophical move at the heart of Stoicism is reframing death not as an ending that negates life, but as a constraint that gives life its shape and urgency. A life without end would be a life without stakes. The fact that it finishes is precisely what makes each portion of it matter. Seneca, another of the great Stoic writers, put it in terms that are still striking today. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. The anticipation of death, he argued, is almost always worse than the thing itself, and the anticipation can be dissolved systematically by looking at it directly and often. Mexico, Tibet, ancient Rome. Three completely different cultures, separated by continents and centuries, arriving at a broadly similar place. That fear of death diminishes not through avoidance, but through some form of sustained, structured engagement. The mechanisms vary considerably. One uses community and celebration, turning death into a social event. Another uses meditative practice and systematic contemplation, turning death into a subject of expertise. A third uses philosophical reasoning and daily reminders, turning death into a lens through which to evaluate the present moment. But the underlying pattern is consistent. Cultures and traditions that produce lower death anxiety tend to be those that keep death visible, present, and integrated into ordinary life, rather than hidden, medicalized, and confined to hospitals and funeral homes, where most people in the modern Western world encounter it only at the very end. Research supports this at a population level. Studies comparing death anxiety across cultures have consistently found lower scores in populations with strong ancestor reverence traditions, established ritual frameworks for engaging with mortality, and communities where death is discussed openly across generations. The paradox in all of this is that the cultures which seem least afraid of death are often those that spend the most time thinking about it. There may be no single answer to the fear of death, but the evidence from across cultures, across centuries, and across the psychology of how human beings actually work points in a fairly consistent direction. The cultures that have found peace with mortality aren't the ones that found a way to forget about it. They're the ones that refused to. They kept the dead nearby. They studied the end carefully. They built it into the calendar, into the philosophy, into the rhythm of daily life, until it became less a source of terror and more simply a fact to live alongside. That's not a denial of death. It might be the most honest response to it. If you found this interesting, there's more like it coming. See you in the next one.